let's dive into one of the most intriguing and dramatic stories in the scriptures, a story that blends beauty, power, tragedy, and pride. Today, we will learn about Absalom, one of the most fascinating characters in the Bible. Absalom was not just any prince. He was the third son of King David, the man after God's own heart. But Absalom is remembered for something far beyond his royal lineage. Considered one of the most handsome men of all time, the Bible describes Absalom in a way that few other figures receive. Imagine a beauty that drew attention wherever he went. Absalom was so extraordinary in his appearance that from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. And his hair? It was his trademark. Thick, imposing, and so impressive that he only cut it once a year. And when he did, the weight of that hair was something remarkable. But as in many stories, this unparalleled beauty comes with a burden. Behind Absalom's flawless appearance was an ambitious and at times dark heart. And this combination of beauty and a thirst for power would set Absalom on a path that would lead him away from what could have been a glorious life alongside his father. Our starting point is here. Prince Absalom, a man whose beauty made him stand out among the people of Israel, but who was also led to make decisions that would completely change his destiny. How could someone so beloved, so admired, end up falling into a web of pride, revenge, and rebellion? This is the story we are about to unravel. Stay with me as we delve into Absalom's journey, understanding how it began with so much potential and ended in such a tragic way. This is the first piece of a puzzle that reveals how pride and vanity can be destructive, even for the most blessed. Absalom was not just the product of a powerful lineage, but also of an exotic and unique origin. His mother, Maacah, was a foreign princess, the daughter of the king of Geshur, a land outside of Israel. Some say she was brought into the kingdom as part of a political agreement or even as spoils of war, a common practice in those days. The fact is that Maacah did not have Jewish roots, which added a fascinating blend to Absalom's heritage. This combination of royal Israeli blood with traits from another people seems to have shaped Absalom into someone of unique beauty. While his father, David, is described as ruddy and striking in appearance, Absalom inherited the best aspects of both worlds. The result was a man who, in the eyes of the people, was the most handsome in Israel. His appearance was not just a matter of aesthetics, it elevated him socially, creating an aura of admiration and respect around him. But it wasn't just his beauty that caught attention. There was something almost mystical about his presence. From head to toe, there was no flaw in him, a detail rarely emphasized so strongly in the Bible. His hair, long and thick, was the symbol of his vanity and pride. Each year he would cut it, and the weight of the locks was so great that it impressed those around him. It was not just a symbol of his beauty, but also of his status. Absalom knew the impact his image had, and he used it to his advantage, fully aware of how his presence dominated any room. This combination of external beauty and distinct origin created an almost untouchable persona. The impression Absalom left went beyond admiration. It fueled his confidence and eventually his arrogance. He saw himself as someone special, someone destined for greatness, and this began to shape his ambitions. Inside him, a flame of dissatisfaction began to grow, a desire for more than just being King David's admired son. Absalom was destined to be more than just a handsome prince. In his mind, he deserved something greater, and this feeling intensified as he looked around and saw his father aging and the kingdom thriving. The beauty that set him apart also isolated him, creating a subtle but dangerous distance between him and reality. And while he secretly nurtured his dreams of grandeur, tragedy was already beginning to loom on the horizon. At this point, Absalom was still admired, respected, and for many, a promise of a bright future for Israel. But the beauty that favored him also planted the seeds of an ambition that would turn into ruin. The wheels of fate were turning, setting the stage for the events that would lead Absalom down a path of vengeance and revolt, a path he believed was his right. While Absalom nurtured his ambitious dreams, a devastating tragedy shook his family and ignited a flame of hatred in his heart. His half-sister, Tamar, became the victim of an atrocity that would forever mark Absalom's destiny. Amnon, David's firstborn and half-brother to Absalom and Tamar, was consumed by a sick and irresistible passion for Tamar. Unable to control his desires, Amnon devised a cruel plan. Pretending to be ill, he requested that Tamar come to his quarters to prepare a meal for him. Unaware of her brother's wicked intentions, Tamar complied. But in a despicable act, Amnon violated her. What was already terrible became even worse when, after the act, Amnon, overtaken by inexplicable contempt, expelled Tamar from his quarters as if she were a disposable object. Tamar, devastated, left carrying the pain and shame of being so cruelly humiliated. She dressed in mourning, covering her head with ashes and tearing her tunic, a sign of her sorrow and loss. This moment was the breaking point for Absalom. Upon seeing his sister in this state, something changed within him. The love he had for his family turned into deep hatred and an uncontrollable thirst for revenge. But Absalom did not act immediately. He kept his grudge in silence for 2 long years, nurturing it until the right moment. During that time, he did not exchange a single word with Amnon. The hatred boiled within him, but Absalom knew he needed to be patient. When he finally felt the time was right, he organized a great feast and invited all the king's sons, including Amnon. On the surface, it was just a celebration, but behind the smiles and music, Absalom's plan for revenge was in motion. During the feast, Absalom instructed his servants to wait until Amnon was drunk. "When he's vulnerable, that's the moment," he said. And so it was done. At the height of the party, as the wine flowed and Amnon was carefree, Absalom's servants followed his orders and brutally murdered Amnon. The act was swift, cold-blooded, and final. But Absalom's revenge was not just about Tamar. It was also a strategic move. With Amnon out of the way, Absalom saw himself a step closer to the line of succession to the throne. He knew that David might not have chosen Amnon as his successor, but with him out of the picture, Absalom believed he was closer to realizing his ambitions. However, this murder had consequences. The kingdom was gripped by shock and fear, and David, upon learning what his son had done, was furious. Absalom knew he could not stay in Jerusalem. With his brother's blood on his hands, he fled into exile, going to Geshur, the land of his maternal grandfather, where he spent the next 3 years waiting for David's wrath to subside. Even from afar, Absalom's plan was far from complete. His mind was already fixed on a greater goal, not just avenging his sister or eliminating a rival, but seizing the throne of Israel for himself. And this desire for power continued to grow, fueled by the certainty that he deserved to be the next king. Tamar's tragedy had given way to boundless ambition, and Absalom was willing to do anything to achieve what he believed was his destiny. 3 years had passed since the murder of Amnon. During this time, Absalom lived in exile in Geshur, far from the eyes of his father in Jerusalem, but also out of reach of any retaliation. However, time did not diminish his ambitions. On the contrary, his thirst for power grew, fueled by the frustration of being away from the kingdom he believed should be his. What he did not know was that in Jerusalem, David's heart was beginning to soften. Despite the severity of what Absalom had done, David's love for his son was deep. The Bible reveals that David missed Absalom, a longing that, over time, surpassed his initial anger. This emotional conflict paved the way for Absalom's return. With the help of Joab, a commander who knew how to manipulate circumstances for his own interests, Absalom was finally allowed to return to Jerusalem. But his return was not entirely triumphant. He could live in the city, but he was still not permitted to see his father's face. This distance was a constant reminder that, despite being back, he still did not have the power he desired. Absalom knew he needed to regain David's favor if he wanted to proceed with his plans. So he began working on his return to prominence. For 2 years, Absalom tried to get David's attention, but to no avail. Tired of waiting, he did something bold. He set fire to Joab's barley fields to force a meeting. This impulsive act got him what he wanted. Finally, Joab brought him to David. When father and son reunited, there was a public reconciliation. David embraced and forgave him, but behind that embrace lay unresolved tension. Absalom was no longer the young prince he once was. He was now a man shaped by vengeance, exile, and ambition. Publicly acknowledged by the king, Absalom regained prominence, but now with a calculated strategy. He positioned himself at the city gates, where citizens came to seek justice. When people came to present their cases to the king, Absalom intercepted them with irresistible charm. He listened to their complaints and said, "If only I were the judge, you would get the justice you deserve." With this, he slowly began winning the hearts of the people. This game of intrigue was just the tip of the iceberg. Absalom was building a support base for something much bigger. He appeared accessible, charismatic, and fair. Everything the people could want in a leader. But behind this facade was a burning desire to take David's place. Over time, Absalom's support grew, and he felt confident enough to take the next step in his plan. Claiming that he needed to fulfill a vow made in Hebron, he asked for permission to go there. David, suspecting nothing, gave his blessing. But Hebron was not just a place of worship. It was the former capital of Israel, where David had begun his reign. Absalom knew exactly what he was doing by choosing this location. In Hebron, he had trumpets sounded and declared himself king, drawing the attention of the entire nation. Absalom's plan was now in full motion, and the revolt he had so carefully plotted was about to confront David in a way the king could never have imagined. Absalom's proclamation in Hebron was the spark that ignited a rebellion that quickly gained momentum. Many in Israel, seduced by his charisma and dissatisfied with David's rule, began to see him as the leader who could bring about a new era. Absalom had prepared well. He wasn't just an ambitious young man. He had carefully planned every detail to maximize his support. By rallying followers from every tribe of Israel, he formed a considerable army. But for Absalom, seizing the throne by force wasn't enough. He wanted to undermine his father's authority from within, so he decided to return to Jerusalem with a bold plan. Once in the city, Absalom entered the palace and, in an act of utter defiance and disrespect, took possession of David's concubines. Taking them to the palace rooftop, he publicly lay with them in full view of everyone. This act wasn't just a show of dominance. In the culture of that time, it represented an official claim to the throne. Absalom was making it clear to the entire nation that he saw himself as the new king of Israel, capable of not only usurping David's power, but also stripping him of the dignity of his reign. Meanwhile, David, caught off guard by the speed and intensity of the rebellion, had to act quickly. Realizing that Absalom was coming with full force, David made a strategic decision to abandon Jerusalem. He knew the city would become the battlefield, and the last thing he wanted was a bloody conflict among his own people. Along with his loyal followers, David fled, crossing the Jordan River and preparing for a decisive battle. However, Absalom wasn't acting alone. Beside him was Ahithophel, one of David's wisest and most respected advisors, who had betrayed the king and joined Absalom's cause. Ahithophel advised an immediate attack, asserting that a swift strike would catch David off guard and ensure victory. Gather 12,000 men, go after the king now, while he is still weakened and disorganized, Ahithophel suggested. But instead of following this straightforward and effective counsel, Absalom also consulted Hushai, another advisor. What Absalom didn't know was that Hushai was loyal to David and had infiltrated to sabotage his plans. With cunning, Hushai argued against Ahithophel's plan, suggesting that Absalom should gather an even larger army and wait for the perfect moment to strike. He played on Absalom's pride, saying that a grand and overwhelming attack would establish him as a hero in the eyes of the people. This advice caused Absalom to hesitate and waste valuable time that David needed to regroup and prepare his forces. Meanwhile, Ahithophel, realizing that his advice had not been followed and sensing that the tide was turning against Absalom, fell into despair. He knew that without the element of surprise, Absalom's rebellion was doomed to fail. In a final act of desperation, he returned home, set his affairs in order, and hanged himself. The weight of Absalom's mistake was already beginning to show. With David having crossed the Jordan and rallied his forces, the final confrontation was looming. Absalom, now holding Israel's fate in his hands, had underestimated not only his father's loyalty and experience, but also how vulnerable his own position truly was. The battlefield was set, and father and son were about to face off in a struggle that would determine the kingdom's future and seal Absalom's tragic fate. The decisive moment was looming. As Absalom consolidated his forces, David, experienced in war and strategy, had already gathered his loyal warriors. He divided his army into 3 parts, each led by trusted commanders. Before the battle, David instructed his leaders, "Deal gently with Absalom for my sake." Despite all the betrayal, a father's love still beat in David's heart, and he did not wish to see his son die. David's army, small but composed of veterans of countless battles, prepared for the confrontation in the dense forest of Ephraim. This environment was not favorable for large armies like Absalom's, which, though numerous, was inexperienced in combat and unfamiliar with the dangers of the terrain. When the battle began, chaos ensued. Absalom's troops were quickly overwhelmed by David's forces, who used their familiarity with the terrain to their advantage. The forest, with its natural traps, proved deadlier than the swords themselves. In that fateful battle, 20,000 men lost their lives. But Absalom's fate was about to meet a cruel irony. Riding a mule, a symbol of royalty, Absalom galloped through the battle when suddenly his famous hair, the very thing that made him so admired, got caught in the branches of a large tree. The mule continued on its path, leaving Absalom hanging between heaven and earth, vulnerable and defenseless. The symbol of his pride had become his deadly trap. One of David's soldiers spotted Absalom hanging and immediately reported it to Joab, the commander. Upon hearing the news, Joab did not hesitate. Ignoring David's orders to spare the young prince, Joab saw the opportunity to end the rebellion once and for all. He went to Absalom and, without mercy, drove 3 darts into his heart. Not satisfied, he ordered his men to pierce him with spears until Absalom's life was completely extinguished. Absalom's death, however, was not just the elimination of a traitor. It was a symbol of the tragedy that unchecked pride and ambition can bring. The young prince, so full of potential and beauty, was now dead, suspended in a tree, just steps away from the throne he so desperately coveted. When Absalom's body was taken down, he did not receive the burial rites befitting his nobility. Instead, his body was thrown into a pit and covered with stones, a mark of dishonor for someone who dared rise against God's anointed. The news of Absalom's death soon reached David. The messenger, fearing the king's reaction, hesitated before telling him. When David finally learned the truth, his heart shattered. In a lament that echoed through the corridors of his palace, David cried out, "Absalom, my son, Absalom, if only I had died instead of you." David's grief was not just the sorrow of a father mourning the loss of his son, but the painful acknowledgement that despite all of Absalom's wrongs, he was still a part of him, flesh of his flesh. With Absalom's death, the rebellion ended, but the cost was high. Israel was left divided, and David himself, though victorious, was never the same again. The tragedy of Absalom served as a grim reminder of how pride, beauty, and ambition can turn into fatal traps. And so ends the journey of one who, with everything in his favor, was ultimately defeated by his own choices and the inescapable destiny he built for himself. After Absalom's death, the battlefield fell silent. The prince, so handsome and ambitious, now lay lifeless, covered by stones in an unmarked pit, a painful image of the end of his journey. As David's forces returned to Jerusalem victorious, the atmosphere was one of mourning and reflection, not celebration. The sadness in David's heart overshadowed the military victory. His cries of grief echoed through the city, and the kingdom of Israel felt the weight of a war that left deep scars. Joab, seeing the king's condition, grew restless. To him, the victory needed to be acknowledged, and David's excessive lament for Absalom's death could demoralize the soldiers who risked their lives to preserve the throne. In a direct confrontation, Joab went to the king and spoke bluntly. "Today you have shamed all your servants who saved your life and the lives of your sons and wives. If Absalom were alive and all of us dead, you would be more pleased. Get up now and go thank your army, or you will lose all support." David, still torn by grief, recognized the truth in Joab's words. He knew that despite his personal loss, the kingdom needed to be unified again, and that started with valuing those who had remained loyal to him. With a heavy heart, David rose and went to the city gates, where his army awaited him. There, he thanked the soldiers for the victory, but the spark that had once lit up the king seemed dimmed. The tragedy of Absalom continued to resonate throughout Israel. The people now asked themselves, how could David's favorite son, someone so admired and loved, end in such a disastrous way? The answer lay in Absalom's choices, shaped by his vanity and arrogance. His beauty, which should have been a blessing, became a burden, fueling a pride that led him away from the path of wisdom. The young prince believed he deserved the throne, but by seeking power through intrigue and violence, he lost not only the kingdom, but also his life. David never fully recovered from Absalom's death. The mourning for his son turned the king into someone more reflective and less confident in his own leadership. He understood that the cycle of violence within his family was not just a consequence of his son's limelight sins, but also a reflection of his own failures as a father and ruler. The sword never departed from his house, as the prophet Nathan had foretold after the incident with Bathsheba, and Absalom was one of the bitterest fruits of that prophecy. For many in Israel, Absalom's downfall was a living lesson about the dangers of unchecked ambition and pride. It wasn't just a story of power and betrayal. It was a warning about how even those who possess everything, beauty, charisma, heritage, and influence, can be destroyed if they don't learn to control their impulses. Absalom's monument, built by himself during his lifetime, still stood, but now it served as a dark symbol of his tragic fate. In today's Jerusalem, Absalom's memorial, known as Yad Avshalom, still exists, reminding visitors on the Mount of Olives of the story of a man who could have been a great king, but who was defeated by his own vanity. David, for his part, continued to reign, but the void left by Absalom was never filled. He knew, deep down, that Absalom's greatest battle was not against him, David, but against himself. David's lament for Absalom was not just for the loss of a son, but for the loss of a future he had envisioned differently. Absalom, with all his beauty and potential, could have been a strong and just leader, someone who would carry on David's legacy. But along his journey, the brightness of his beauty was overshadowed by the darkness of his ambitions. The relationship between father and son was never fully restored, and that gap between them was filled with pain, pride, and the decisions that sealed their fate. After Absalom's death, David returned to Jerusalem, but it wasn't the triumphant return it had once been. The nation was wounded, divided between those who had supported the rebellion and those who remained loyal to the king. Rebuilding trust in the kingdom required time and patience, but the emotional wounds David carried were much deeper. Absalom's death was a constant reminder that, despite all the power and wisdom he held as king, he had failed to protect his own family from internal destruction. Absalom's legacy, paradoxically, became one of warning. He became a symbol of what can happen when outward beauty and charisma are paired with unchecked pride and blind ambition. For the people of Israel, Absalom's story was a narrative that went beyond politics or the struggle for power. It was a lesson about human nature and the inevitable consequences of choices made with a heart hardened by vanity. In collective memory, Absalom was marked not just as the traitor who rebelled against his own father, but as someone who, despite all the blessings and privileges, could not escape the traps he created himself. His monument, still standing in Jerusalem, became a point of reflection for those who knew his story. People throw stones at the base of the monument as a tradition, a gesture symbolizing the rejection of the path Absalom chose. And David? His reign continued, but with a heavier burden on his shoulders. Each time Absalom's name was mentioned, it was impossible for him not to feel the pain of a story that could have had a different ending. The repetition of his lament, "Absalom, my son, Absalom," was not just an expression of grief, but a plea for his son's spiritual redemption, as if by calling out to him, he could somehow reach Absalom's spirit and ease his suffering. As the years passed, David prepared to pass the kingdom to his successor, but the shadow of Absalom never fully dissipated. It hovered over David's decisions, over the court, and even over Israel's future. His tragic journey was an open wound, a reminder that even the most powerful of kings cannot avoid the consequences of errors within their own household. The story of Absalom, therefore, is not just about a rebellious son or a failed revolution. It is about how pride, beauty, and vanity can turn blessings into curses. Absalom could have been a great leader, but instead, he became an eternal example of how outward brilliance can conceal inner shadows that, when left unchecked, lead to destruction. And so, Absalom lives on in memory, not as the king he dreamed of being, but as a warning etched in the stones that cover his forgotten grave.